Hi, everyone, and again, welcome to our Power University webinar number 6 on firmware updates. Today's agenda includes an eConnect firmware review, how to identify your firmware version, important steps for a successful firmware update, an example review, and some helpful resources that will include more information about this topic. So let's have a quick eConnect firmware review. If you use our eConnect PDUs, you've probably already worked with the firmware that enables their features and solutions. The controller module in our PDUs will include this firmware and the capability of upgrading it with enhanced features and solutions. To ensure your PDUs have the latest features and solutions, we consistently throughout the year upload on our website what's called a firmware version. And these must be uploaded to the PDU as soon as they come out. Our latest firmware versions are 5.3.1094 and 4.13.1094. The firmware will be in what's called a .bin file that you can access in the software section from our website. Release notes are shared for each firmware version, specifying any changes or enhancements added to that specific release. Firmware versions are released twice a year in the calendar year. Our network RFID, electronic lock kit, and electronic access control also require specific firmware versions in order to operate properly. The network RFID electronic lock kit requires any firmware version starting with 5.3 to enable its capabilities. On the other hand, any network electronic access control will use a 4.13 firmware version to enable its capabilities. It's always important to double check which type you have before uploading the firmware version. Now let's discuss identifying your firmware version. The one important step before we learn how to complete a firmware upgrade is to identify the current firmware version that's in the PDU. From the web GUI, you can find this information two ways. The first option is to check the top gray box or section. At the bottom, it will show the current installed firmware version. The second option is to go to the Administration tab, click on Advanced, and under PDU Info, it will show the current firmware version number. Now, if you're looking directly from the actual PDU locally, you can go to PDU Settings on the display and select where it says Info. Then it should show as the picture to the right in the slide the software or firmware version. There's also a way to see the firmware version from a bulk API standpoint by using version with the get method for the bulk secure array upgrade. Now, what are some steps for a successful firmware update? First, you'll want to confirm the current firmware version on your eConnect PDU. As explained in the previous slides, make sure to confirm what the current firmware is so you know what's the best next firmware version needed. When a PDU has an older firmware version, it is best to double check with our tech support team so they can guide you on your upgrade path. The second step is to visit the resources section in the CPI website and click on software. There you will log in to have access to our most recent firmware version. If you don't have access to log in, then you can create an account in our website. And the steps are very simple and takes less than a minute. The third step is to choose an upgrade method that works best for you. You can choose from a USB upgrade if you're upgrading locally, a web GUI upgrade, a bulk API upgrade. And always double check you have the correct .bin file with the firmware version you need. The fourth step is to upload the firmware version to the USB, and in this case, make sure it's just the .bin file. Or you can upload it to the web GUI or the primary PDU in case you are working with a secure array. Step number 5 is to follow the upgrade steps for any of these methods that you choose. Step 6, once you follow the steps for the upgrade in the chosen method, allow time for the PDU to reboot. This won't affect any outlet functions. During reboot time, the controller module is replacing the previous firmware version with the one being installed, and the reboot time may vary according to the updates that need to happen on the PDU. Just be patient while it's doing this and do not interrupt or stop the process once started. Specifically for the web GUI, it will take you to the login page once the reboot is done. If done locally on the PDU, you will see the LED light and display coming back up when the unit has finished upgrading. Finally, confirm the desired firmware version has been uploaded by using the same steps shown on the previous slides. And here are some examples on how the process for firmware upgrade looks like. In the web GUI, you want to make sure to only upload the .bin file. When done locally on the PDU, you want to make sure to follow the steps as explained in the manual. And here you can see a sample of when the screen shows that it's been updated and when the update has failed. With bulk API, you can use the firmware upgrade with bulk. And these are just some examples of how it would look like when you're doing the firmware upgrade in any of these methods. Now let's look at an example from the web GUI. This is from my lab that I've set up a PDU, a number of PDUs, so this is one of them. And the upgrade is happening from a firmware version of 5.3.1054, and I will be doing an upgrade to 5.3.1094. So I am in the Administration tab, the Upgrade Firmware section. I'm checking for the firmware version that is currently on the PDU, and I'm reading through the instructions to make sure that I'm following them correctly. And then I select the method in the web GUI that I will be using to upload the .bin file. And the .bin file has been uploaded. I'm checking the instructions and then click on upgrade. Okay, so now we see a message that says file was verified and or installed successfully. So this means that the firmware version, the new firmware version, has been uploaded successfully. And now the next step is to wait for an indication that we can log into the PDU from the web GUI and see the new firmware version. In the web GUI's case, that will look like going back to the login page. So even though there is this confirmation that says file was verified and are installed successfully, we still have to wait for the login page to come in. So another way to check what may be going on, let's say you want to double check if the page hasn't been frozen. If you try to refresh the page, it really won't show anything. So that's why I'm canceling the option here, just to show you. And the way you can confirm if the changes have been made, another way, let's say, if you don't want to wait, is to try to log in to the PDU again. And if you see that it just takes you to an error page, then it means that it hasn't been processed yet. What we want to see is that login page. So here, I'm trying to log in to my PDU again, and notice how it's not letting me. And then this page is still processing. You still don't see the login page. And now notice how the original page goes into the login page. And now I can access the PDU with the new firmware version. It's in the PDU info and also in the gray box at the top. So some of the helpful resources you can use to ensure you have a successful firmware upgrade are going to be in the eConnect PDU user manual. You can visit pages 25 to 26, page 30, and pages 56 to 57. And specifically for RESTful API firmware upgrade, you can visit the eConnect PDU RESTful API user guide in pages 10, 18, and 50 to 51.